From Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ever since its ill-advised inception and inclusion in the Dodd-Frank Act, Republicans have largely unified about many issues with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Its unconstitutional, unaccountable leadership structure has been litigated before the Supreme Court. Its unaccountable funding structure, chiefly the fact that its funding comes from the Federal Reserve, not the duly elected members of Congress, will likely be addressed during the court's October session. None of us know, nor should presume to know, what the court will decide on the latter issue. But as written, the underlying bill addresses concerns with funding structures, with the funding structure by funding the CFPB through the regular appropriations process. This amendment retains that provision at a level of 0, and I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For purposes, the gentleman from Maryland.
Claim time in opposition.
The gentleman's recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. The CFPB is a vital safeguarding the interests of American consumers. You're on your own. That's the ongoing message that Americans hear from our Republican colleagues. You're on your own. We're not going to protect you. It serves, the CFPB serves as an independent agency dedicated to ensuring that financial products and services are fair, transparent, and free from deceptive practices. Very frankly, we're dealing with trillion-dollar financial institutions. And there is no consumer except the most expert who can, on their own, make sure they're getting a fair shake. On their own, make sure they're not getting rolled. Make sure that they're not being ripped off. That's what this agency is supposed to do. By holding financial institutions accountable, the CFPB protects consumers from predatory lending, fraud, and other forms of financial exploitation. That's the little guy. That's the little guy who can't do it for himself or herself and is counting on us to make sure that what is represented to them is, in fact, what's going to happen, is fair and not, as I said, ripping them off. The CFPB promotes fair and transparent financial markets by enforcing regulations and consumer protection laws. This oversight helps maintain the integrity of the financial system, fostering trust and confidence among consumers and businesses alike. And if we don't have it, if we zero fund it, guess what? Confidence is going to go away, and guess what? Financial institutions, some very small, some medium size, the large, maybe they'll get away with it. They'll be able to sustain themselves, but the financial system will lack confidence. And we know that confidence is critical to the financial community and our economy operating effectively. CFPB conducts investigations, issues fines, and enforces compliance to deter companies from engaging in harmful or fraudulent activities, ultimately reducing the risk of financial crisis and market instability. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to oppose this amendment. Very frankly, as I've said in the past, in the 20s we didn't have these. The 1920s, not the 2020s. In the 1920s we didn't have any of these protection agencies. And the reason they were created in the 30s to try to stabilize the markets. And very frankly, we've had an extraordinary market for the most part. Now, I've been here when we've had some real downturns, and confidence was lost. But if we eliminate CFPB and other like agencies, or frankly reduce the resources that some agencies like the SEC have to make sure that our markets are safe and secure and transparent, then our economy is not going to be the kind of economy, frankly, that we want, and very frankly that we have now in terms of a pretty vital, vibrant market creating some 13 million, 14 million jobs over the last 24 months. So I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle This is not about politics. This is about our economy, its stability, and the confidence that people have in it. Vote no on this amendment.
Gentlemen yield or reserve?
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's amazing to me, somehow this country made it a couple hundred years without the CFPB, and now we can't wake up in the morning without it. The CFPB operates off a fundamentally flawed assumption that our fellow Americans, the little guy, is a rube. They lack the agency and the intelligence to choose products and services that fit their needs, and instead must be infantilized while furthering empowering a government that does not have their best interests at heart. Their villainization of mundane services provided by banks and credit unions leaves our constituents with fewer, more expensive options. I yield to the good gentleman from Florida, as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we should be in support of this amendment, and for one very important reason. The CFPB is unconstitutional. It is an agency that was given legislative powers through Dodd-Frank, one of the worst pieces of financial regulatory legislation ever to come through this chamber. And it has no accountability and no oversight from the members of Congress. They go to the Federal Reserve to get their money. They go out to the public and they actually are writing regulations that Congress has not even contemplated and putting out oversight that Congress has never actually voted for, and they're doing it with no oversight of the people's body. Just yesterday, the CFPB went to Apple, Google, and the payment firms and came up with new proposed rules on digital wallets, when this chamber has not even come out with legislation around digital wallets and digital assets. We've not done that work in the people's house. So to allow an agency like this to continue to operate with no oversight, they can go in and out of any company they choose to based upon the whims of Mr. Chopra, is not constitutional, and it is not be fit for an agency under the government of, by, and for the people. I will also add that the bill presented by Mr. Barr from Kentucky is a good step in the right direction, because it would at least give Congress Article I oversight powers over the CFPB. And it would allow us to do the thing that Mr. Perry is arguing for, which is, frankly, zeroing out this agency and eliminating it altogether. Let's speak to consumer protections, which the gentleman from Maryland has talked about. Before CFPB, consumer protections actually were within the purview of all the other federal agencies that are under the oversight guise of Congress. CFPB was created so that they wouldn't have to come here for oversight. I have no problem with making sure that consumers are protected, but not by a rogue, unconstitutional agency that should not exist. With that, I will yield back to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Look, we've had this discussion a little earlier on Mr. Barr's legislation. This is before the Supreme Court. You're making a representation that this is unconstitutional. You're going to find out the answer to that probably by early summer of next year. We'll be in session. We can respond to that. This is a matter that ought to be considered out of the Financial Services Committee, ought to be reported to the floor, and we ought to consider. This was not adopted without thought. You may disagree with the conclusion that was arrived at, but it had a lot of discussion. And by the way, for those of you who have not been here a long time, it had a conference. Now, you may not know what a conference is, but what a conference is we pass legislation, the Senate passes, and they go meet. We hardly do that anymore, unfortunately, and that's sad. In my view, I've been here for a long time, and conferences are good. But that's the way the process ought to work, not just putting something here and zero funding an agency that was created. I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair rather than to other members. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reminding everybody that the CFPB was all a Democrat conference. There were no Republicans. I yield time 1 minute to the gentleman, Mr. Norman.
Mr. Norman, gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
I fully support Chairman Perry's amendment. This agency is a rogue agency. And let me give you an example to my friend to my left. The CFPB is irresponsible and reckless. In February of 2023, a CFPB employee made an unauthorized transfer of records to a personal email account containing personal information of 256,000 customers. It affected over 45 institutions. We've sat with Chopra during the hearing. He's unregulated. I don't know if you've ever been on a bank board. They're the most regulated group. And you know who pays the price of the fines that they come up with through vague, in today's world, climate change? All these customers up here that are trying to borrow money. It never should have existed, and to keep it funded and to keep it under this, as it exists with the personnel, we're going backwards. I fully support this. I yield back.
I reserve and yield the remainder of the time and to close to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr.
Well,
The gentleman from Kentucky has 30 seconds remaining.
Well, I thank my friend from Pennsylvania, and I compliment him and applaud him for introducing a very legitimate amendment to address the unconstitutional structure of the agency and the fact that they are a rogue agency. And there's no greater critic of the CFPB than me, and ask Mr. Chopra about that. But I reluctantly rise in opposition, surprisingly maybe to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, to this amendment, not because the agency doesn't deserve a check the way Mr. Perry wants, but because it is important for this institution that we assert in the long run, the appropriations power of this body. And that's why I support the Womack bill, which funds the agency and deprives the court of the excuse to uphold the agency. And I yield.
All time